Good afternoon, everyone. Our panel today is a conversation with a spine. Fewer questions, but deeper ones, and questions to understand how we collectively can create impact, going beyond what works in social welfare. As you all know, governments have been very good at helping people do the right thing. Behavioral science helped simplify decisions, remove friction, and guide behavior. But life is now changing faster than systems can keep up, and uncertainty is constant. And social welfare exists for these moments. Systems provide support, but they also do something more powerful. They shape how people see themselves. So today we're going to talk about welfare systems. And yes, welfare is a safety net, but it's also a teacher. It teaches people whether they're capable, whether they're trusted, whether they're expected to steer their own lives. So this session is called Empowerment by Design because we're exploring a shift from welfare that shapes behavior to welfare that builds human capacity. And that's the conversation we're going to have today with our esteemed guest. So before we begin, I'll just tell you how the conversation will go. I'm going to ask one central question to each guest, and then it's not only to extract answers, but to surface a lot of judgments that will help us all in our decision making. So to David Halpern, you were central to bringing behavioral science into governments, and you helped states shape decisions at scale. So I want to ask you with not what works, but what lasts. So here's the question. What does behavioral science genuinely when does it empower people, and when does it quietly cross an invisible line, training people to function only when the system exists?
Right, it's a great question. Thank you. It's lovely to be here. Your Excellencies and other esteemed guests. So the classic thing that people tend to think of with behavioral science is what's called changing the choice architecture. So we go to the canteen, and it's a good idea to put the salad before the chips, was a good example, because we're in a hurry and we're hungry. And one argument is when you remove that, well, will I just go back to eating all the chips? Well, an important point is the canteen is still there today and tomorrow and so on. And it can also start to change your taste too. But will it stick? Will it persist in other ways? And so there's more and more interest in interventions, which we were just saying before, not just nudges, but are called boosts in some ways. And a good welfare one we were talking about at a session earlier today is many welfare systems are built around what's called active welfare. Are you really looking for work? So across the world, by the way, they are better than not asking people, you know. So you turn up and you have to show that you look for several jobs. Now, I've sat in on those interviews. One of the things we did as good behavioral scientists, you're like ethnographers and you spend time out there. And you'd see, for example, I come to my mind, a young man coming into one of these sessions. He knows exactly the routine, what he's supposed to do, fill in the form, tick this thing. He's almost on autopilot. He's been trained by the system to do that. And so we changed it from a system, instead of asking people, what did you do last week, to say, what are you going to do next week? Which sounds like a small change, but it turns out to be really fundamental, because you are now activating someone to be, think ahead and so on. Another key change, though, goes to your point, is instead of the administrator doing the paperwork, we said the person should do it themselves. They should write down themselves what they're going to do next week, not for them. And first of all, you can see when this change came in, people are almost like, wait a minute, what? You do the paperwork, don't you? No, because you're trying to mobilize and activate someone. So these are really important kind of shifts as we try and make, sometimes you create scaffolding, but you make change. And in the end, we're trying to make people not just make better decisions, but be better decision makers in their own right, which I think goes to your point.
So you mentioned something about activate. Can you give us an example of what distinguishes the intervention that changes behavior for a moment, so you change the person that you said, you asked him what you're going to do next week,
yes,
to changing his identity for a lifetime? And so can you give us a bit of a sneak peek? There's something more cooler than nudging called boosting. That David Halpern is working on. So I want to understand, what does boosting do? Does it change someone's identity forever? Does it leave an imprint, a soul print?
Very good. So yes, this is, I mentioned, and thank you for pushing on it. If I'm working on a book here, spending some time here and also on Boost. So I'll give you an example, and we were just talking about it, from again, young people. This is some work in the US, but we see it in many other places. So young people who, in Chicago classically, brought in quite difficult circumstances, and they have learned in their lives, if someone pushes you, you better push back. If someone comes along as you're a young kid and says, "Can I have your pocket money?" If you don't push back, they'll come back tomorrow and ask for your mobile phone, right? So you learn it, and then you learn to react hard. This leads to violence often because it becomes inappropriate as the kids become men. So there was this program called Becoming a Man, developed by Chicago, and it was inspired by a murder, I'm afraid to say, of a young, lovely PhD student from Senegal, actually, who was shot by a 17-year-old. He came out of the library, he had books on, it was late at night, he gets stopped by this kid. He must have just paused, resisted for a second, he gets shot and he dies. Now that 17-year-old was eventually given 120 years in prison. Was that going to make a difference if it had been 200 years or 300 years to his behavior in that moment? So the idea of this Becoming a Man program was that, we need to reach into the minds of these young people. And so this exercise, and I was just explaining if it's not too long, they'd give these young people, put them into pairs, and they'd say, "Here's a ball, I'll give the ball to you, I'm supposed to take it from you." You can imagine these kids start scrapping, and they pull and they're punching and whatever. And then eventually it's calm down, okay, let's talk about what happened there. And they'll say, "Why didn't you just ask him for the ball?" None of them ask. Well, why would I do that? He'll think I'm a punk, that was the word. So they said, "Well, let's ask him. If we'd said, would you give him the ball?" You'd say, "Yeah, it's a stupid ball. What do I care about the ball?" But it illustrates a very profound point, which these young people have got a mindset, which is, I push back. And the kids themselves call this program, it's based about cognitive behavioral therapy, but Control-Alt-Shift. Like you do on a computer, when it's not working properly, you press it. So when you become emotional and angry, wait a minute, I just stopped myself. Is there an alternative? So if that's not a nudge now, that is what we would call a boost, a very powerful program, halves violence, halves subsequent arrest in these young people. This is very powerful for lots of things. We could all use a boost in a similar way, sometimes.
I'd like to reflect on that. This relates a lot to social welfare because welfare or social welfare changes a lot of outcomes for people's lives. But the question we all need to ask is, does it even shape people? Will they grow? What will happen to their mind? Do they still depend on us? And I think that's where empowerment comes into place. I have one more question. If we want to be successful or truly serious about empowerment in different realms of policy, what should governments stop doing even when it looks successful on paper, but actually it doesn't change anything, because if you remove that system, that person will not change his behavior forever. So it's kind of going beyond the nudge, but it might look amazing on paper. Can you give us an example on that?
Well, I think we often see it in welfare systems where people become dependent. Other examples we see in other countries is that the example I mentioned earlier is because the systems are often designed on the basis we think you might be cheating, and so they inadvertently signal, because one of the things about human beings is we don't quite know what other people think, and so we have to infer. And if a system is treating us like I might be cheating, then I think, well, maybe everybody else is cheating, right? It becomes actually potentially toxic. So there are times where if we build this scaffolding to make the change, to get someone back into a labour market or whatever it will be, we should also think about, can we dismantle it and will it persist? And so that's true in many areas where, be it on diet or whatever, why we often move to reformulation, because we want to move the upstream things. We can remove the scaffolding and the behaviour will change. Or in the example I gave earlier, that the young person is literally thinking differently. Their system 2, as we would say, kicks in at the right moment. So we can step back. They'll look after it themselves.
Thank you, David. Minister Masagos, you govern across culture, policy, real human capacity. And what distinguishes, I think, your work is it doesn't just begin with policy, it begins with people. So I want to place you inside the choral moral tension of social welfare. Mm-hmm. How does Singapore balance providing social support while preserving the agency of these beneficiaries and enabling empowerment without the scaffolding?
Yes. Well, thank you for the opportunity to address the esteemed audience here, and also to have an interaction with people who know where the evidence is. So all of us know how to do it, but governments need to decide who should be doing it, where it should apply, and when. And what we have decided when I took over about 7 years ago, the Ministry for Social and Family Development, is to shift focus on the individual to the family. That was the first paradigm shift we did. Because when we want something to last, or even something to begin, it begins with the family. Values get transmitted through the family. And also, while rights are important, very critical, to ensure rights of children, women, everything must be provided for, we must also recognize, at least in our societies, that duties are as important. So duties is always something we balance with rights, and that happens best in a family. So the family need to be functioning, and therefore, in defining a functioning family in Singapore, we put it quite simply in 3 S's, which we measure with our researchers and so forth. Are they stable? Are they self-reliant? Do they attain self-mobility? Now, this applies to all families. And some families, though, do fall through the crack temporarily, and how then do we bounce them up to attain these 3 S's and not lose these 3 S's? But some family can be entrenched because of their circumstances and so forth. And therefore, where do we start this work? We have now shifted from from waiting for the families to come to us when they have trouble, to knocking doors, identifying who would be vulnerable, and being proactive and upstream. And this is something is very difficult to do because it's more costly and takes a lot of time. And it's harder for research to show that you have prevented something from happening because it didn't happen. And therefore, we have to sort of reshape how we approach this and going upstream. As an example, we now have looking at the data of those who we think in all probability, using AI, using data, large models and so forth, say these are the group of families we should knock doors, and then we want to provide support for them. And here is who should be doing it. And it is not something we have decided, and we think that no government can do it alone, and to bring all the community assets together, including volunteers who become befrienders to these families, corporates who have money, who at one time will just give the money to philanthropies and then walk away and say, I've given millions of dollars, but to measure the impact and to make it a sustainable contribution. Not one time, not 2 times, but how many years for the impact to be felt, then it's reported back to them. And also professionals who need to be uplifted. So a whole of society approach, and then using the sciences that our esteemed researchers tell us over time how it has changed and what we can do, and put that together. I think that's the framework with which our government address this problem. And like you mentioned, it's moving from social welfare to empowerment, self-reliant.
On that, Minister, I want to ask you, how do welfare systems strengthen dignity and ownership? And if you can give us an example, when you said the focus is on family, did you use behavioral science to nudge them maybe, or you're thinking of a policy that will boost them towards not relying only on the system and not creating this dependency? Because it's also a mindset among beneficiaries.
Indeed. In fact, this is the gist of the design that we have in a program we call Comlink Plus. First, identifying who will be vulnerable, and then inviting them to join the program, not telling them you have to join the program, inviting them. Actually, half of the families we outreach to joined us. The other half say, either leave us alone, or we don't believe this program, or whatever reason, but you want to respect them for that. And the families that come with us, we provide them 3 important resources. Number 1, the befrienders, people who need to be there for no other reason than I care, not because I want to, I have something more than you and I want to share with you, or whatever it is. I just want to be your friend. And therefore, people they can go back to when they have problems they need to share about, personal problems. And then we have what we call almost a para-counselors, para-social workers. These are trained about programs, not the social work type of program, but what programs are available to nudge them to do, for now, 3 things. Number 1, to ensure they keep their children in school. Enroll the children early, because preschool is a very important part of development. If they may have given up on their lives, we want them to see the future in their children. And that
How did you nudge them to ensure that they enroll their kids? Like, what policy was it a nudge or a decree or a law?
Yes. The simple policy is to give them money if they put their children.
So an incentive with money. But
Incentive.
if you remove the money, what's
Yes.
going to happen? Did they believe in it? Do they believe in the power of early education?
Which is why the befriender is important, to persuade them and to show them what works. I come from a family which benefited from social mobility. And when I meet them and say, look, I used to be like you too. I live in a home which I rented. I moved 11 times before I was 3 years old. But in Singapore, you don't have to be like this all your life, all for your children. Just keep your children in school. Start them early. So that kind of advice, that kind of personal connection is important. But many people who do this don't know where the programs are. And therefore, you need to have trained coaches who know what different kind of archetypes of family need. At the same time, then, those who we know could be in trouble or need more therapies and so forth, that's when the social worker comes in. So again, it's a whole of society program. Just one point is that much of the incentives are contributed not by the government. It's given by corporates who say, I want to do the preschool program. I will give $10 million every year, but you make sure you spend it, and I want to see the impact. So they see the connection between being good, not just a company that makes money, but with a social mission. Actually, we have also found out that the employees choose this kind of company, especially the young. And putting this all together is something we have started moving for the last 3 years. But again, research is going to be very important to validate whether what we are doing is good, what we're doing is impactful. And I say, we don't want to conclude that this will have a good outcome, but certainly we are happy with the involvement of so many parts of society together, including the dignity that we give to the families who want to do this.
I think when we talk about welfare and empowerment, it's not a simple equation to say when we use this nudge and we remove it, what's going to happen to the people. We need to really study it over the long term. Who people become, did they grow, did it change? And what I'm hearing from you all is empowerment and social welfare is more than design. Yes. It is about understanding the proper discipline of policymakers to really stick with the decision and self-correct along the way, especially with dependence and social welfare. So it requires a lot of courage. I want to end as a joint question for both of you. How do we know when the support is still helping, or when it's quietly replaced people's judgment that they don't even think for themselves anymore? In your case, giving the money for young parents to put their kids in school, they automatically will just enroll them because you gave them the incentive of their money. Remove the money, I don't think so. They really believed in it could be applied to health, to parenting, to a professional life. How do you know that they really believe in it? So maybe the idea of boosting, and I just want to clarify what I mean here. When welfare builds capacity and it changes people's mindset, it builds dignity. Yes. When you are building dependency and you took away their agency, you're kind of creating this kind of reliance and it erodes dignity. And so the question, and maybe the highest ambition or goal of social policy, is not better compliance to my nudge, it's stronger people. And goes back to, David, what you said, it's did we grow people, did we change them, did you change the mindset of that guy? So what's your 2 cents on that, on building capacity, and what empowerment by design truly means?
So it's very interesting that you talked about parenting too, because I think there's a classic kind of a distinction often made in parenting, which is very relevant to government, which is when you're teaching your kids. It's normally a contrast between, are you liberal? You do whatever you want. Like, that turns out, by the way, not to be great, often. Or do you be authoritarian, which is, I tell you exactly, you could do this. lots and lots of rules. That's not great either. And the magic formula is what's called authoritative. So you intervene occasionally, but you explain to your child why. When they're going to put their kids in the electrical socket, you don't just say, no, we never do that. So you shouldn't do it because you explain why. And what's the difference? Is because authoritative means they now understand the world, and it sticks, it persists when you're not there as well, right? And that to some extent applies to governments too. We need to be in the authoritative space. You talked about, I think, dignity. I tried to give you an example earlier. A key part about that is you're no longer being a policeman, but you're respecting the person's dignity and they're building their own agency. But the last thing which we touched on, I think, is incredibly important and often underestimated in Western governments is the social network and the community. It's the family, absolutely. Who is your first line of call for welfare when you need it? It is your family. It may be your neighbors, your friends. Only late on is it often government. And it often reminds me of some work we've been doing at the moment with communities and community building, is that it's been underestimated the importance of building the community infrastructure. Singapore, famously example of it. And it reminds me of almost a biblical example, of the feeding of the 5,000. How does that work? We sort of see it in everyday life, where you enable people to mutually support each other is an incredibly powerful tool, which you don't see if you only see it welfare through a very narrow individual lens.
Yes.
What's your take on the authoritative space of government?
Well, the most important thing for me, at least, is to have the courage to share and to open this data to researchers, to people who will then present this and criticize you in public to say, no, this doesn't work. Or the evidence says that you have to shift it somewhere else. For the longest time, governments have internal mechanisms to do that, and you can hide your embarrassment because you don't share the data. Today in Singapore, more and more of us are in various parts of government want third parties to come appraise us, give us a critique, even publish the paper, and be open about it. Because we know that the virtue of all what governments want to do, this is always the part that we are very happy about. But the courage to accept that there are failures and that we need to shift can only come from people who produce this from evidence, from research that is objective, no motivation, not a political opposition, whatever it is. And therefore, you can take it even with a pinch of salt. And then you move on. They say, yes, this is something we have misgivings about, we should move on. And this is how Singapore has improved over the years. Starting from internal criticism and not sharing it, and now, hopefully with more courage to share this data with the external evaluators to tell us how to do it better.
I think as I reflect on both, the quiet truth of maybe behavioral science is that every system we build is building a human being. Not loudly, not dramatically, but relentlessly on what it assumes as a policy, what it rewards, and I think also maybe what it requires. And if we take social welfare, it's also a teacher. It builds capacity. It's telling these people and these beneficiaries whether they're capable, whether the government believes in them, whether they're trusted, but also not to comply, and whether they're expected to try on their own. Yes. And I think for us, as you said, data, the authoritative space of government, we need to kind of explain why, but also create that ecosystem around it. So it's not just one cut solution.
Indeed.
I know this is the end of our session. There's 30 seconds. I just want to say thank you for your time and insights today, and we can't wait to understand what boosting can do to policy, and also understand and learn from Singapore. If there's something beautiful about Singapore, we love the intellectual humility you all exude from all governments around the world. And maybe Dave Halpern said it so perfectly that any innovation that happens around the world, you'll always see a Singaporean learning from that innovation. And I think it's something that also the UAE exudes, the love for learning and the love for self-correction. And I hope all of us as governments continue to improve our social policies. And thank you all for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.